The winter sun had barely dipped below the horizon when the cold began to move across the wide Arizona plains like a great silent wave. Jake Callahan knew the signs well: the sudden stillness in the air, the sharp bite in the wind, the way the sky shifted from copper to steel. He had lived on the open land long enough to understand that storms on the high desert never asked permission. They came fast, strong, and without kindness. Tonight felt like one of those nights. Jake finished tying down the last of the shutters on his small wooden cabin, pulling the rope tight with a firm tug. The wood creaked softly under the pressure, as if protesting the work. He stepped back, rubbed his hands together for warmth, and watched the clouds gathering in the distance. They stacked on each other like layers of gray wool, thick and heavy, swallowing every bit of remaining light. The cold brushed against his face again, sharper this time, almost like a warning. He walked back toward the cabin door, brushing bits of dry grass from his worn coat. The door hinges groaned gently as he pushed it open and stepped inside. The moment the door closed behind him, the world outside became a muffled hum, and the warmth from the small stone fireplace greeted him with soft arms. The flames danced gently, the only lively thing in the quiet room. Jake hung his coat on a peg by the wall and took a slow breath, letting the warmth settle into his bones. He lived alone, and the silence of the place never bothered him. It was the kind of silence that felt honest, a silence he could understand. The wind outside gathered strength and pushed against the cabin walls, reminding him why he appreciated the sturdy structure he had built with his own hands years ago. He moved to the table near the fire, where a simple meal waited: bread, a bit of dried meat, and a tin cup half filled with warm tea. He wasn't a man of fancy habits. Life on the open land shaped people into something plain but steady. Jake had never needed more than that. He sat down, letting the firelight flicker across his face, and listened to the storm growing outside. The wind whistled through the cracks, soft but persistent, almost like a lonely song. He took a sip of his tea, letting the warmth fill his chest, and glanced toward the window. Snowflakes had begun to drift against the glass, tiny and gentle at first, as if testing the land to see if it would welcome them. Jake leaned back in his chair and stretched his legs toward the fire. He had planned to mend a saddle before turning in for the night, but the cold had slowed his motivation. Instead, he simply watched the flames and thought about the quiet simplicity of the evening ahead. Stormy nights were usually peaceful inside his little home. Sometimes he would read an old book or sharpen the tools he used on the range. Sometimes he just sat and let his thoughts wander. Tonight, however, something felt different. He sensed it like a small tug in his chest, nothing alarming, just a subtle feeling that the night held something unexpected. The kind of feeling a person gets when the world is about to move in a direction they didn't plan for. He stood up and added another log to the fire, watching it catch and glow. The storm outside grew louder, brushing snow against the walls, sweeping across the empty land like a restless spirit. Jake walked to the window and leaned slightly to the side, trying to see through the thickening curtain of snow. The world outside had already begun to disappear, swallowed by white. He turned away and began clearing his small table, collecting the dishes and placing them near the wash basin. The simple movement of cleaning soothed him, grounding him in routine. He rinsed the cup, wiped down the wooden surface, and prepared to settle into his chair for the night. Then it happened. A sound so soft, so faint, touched the edge of his hearing. Jake froze, listening. At first he thought it was the wind shifting, but then it came again. A small, uncertain tap. It was almost too gentle to notice, as if someone were trying to knock without disturbing whatever lived inside. Jake's heart paused for a brief moment. No one ever came to his cabin this late. Not in winter. Not in a storm. Not out here where miles stretched between one home and the next. He moved quietly toward the door, his boots tapping softly on the wooden floor. The faint knocking came again, still delicate, still hesitant, but undeniably real. The sound felt so out of place in the quiet room that he wondered if he had imagined it. But he hadn't. Jake reached the door and rested his hand on the latch. For a moment, he simply listened. The wind pressed against the walls with a steady push, but beneath that, under the swirl of the storm, a soft voice threaded through the sound. It was weak, barely more than a breath. "Please, let me in." Jake's breath caught. He wasn't sure he had heard correctly. The voice was faint, almost swallowed by the storm. He leaned closer to the door. "I'm freezing." The words were clearer this time, though still soft and fragile, as if she was losing strength with each syllable. Without hesitation, Jake pulled the latch and opened the door. The cold burst into the cabin instantly, sweeping across the room and stealing the warmth from his skin. Snow blew in through the opening, but Jake's eyes were fixed on the figure standing just outside. A woman wrapped in a thin, worn blanket stood trembling on his doorstep. Snow clung to her dark hair and lashes. Her clothes, meant for milder weather, were soaked and stiff from the cold. She looked exhausted, her lips pale, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the blanket around her. She was clearly an Apache woman, her features unmistakable, her expression a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Her breath came out in small clouds, and her knees wobbled beneath her. Jake reacted without thinking. He stepped forward, reached out, and gently supported her as her legs almost gave out. Her skin felt like ice beneath the blanket, cold enough to alarm him. She tried to speak again, but the words caught in her throat, her teeth chattering too hard to form full sentences. "Come in," Jake said, his voice soft but firm. He guided her inside carefully, making sure she didn't slip on the wooden floor. Once the door was closed, the storm became only a distant roar again, leaving the warm, orange glow of the cabin to fill the space around them. The woman's eyes darted around the room, as if unsure whether she was safe, yet too weak to protest. Jake moved her toward the fire and eased her down onto a soft rug. The heat touched her slowly, as if her body had forgotten what warmth felt like. He grabbed a thick wool blanket from a nearby shelf and wrapped it gently around her shoulders. She closed her eyes briefly, a small sigh escaping her lips, as if the simple kindness was more than she expected. "Stay close to the fire," Jake said softly. "You're safe here." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and exhaustion. Her lips moved, but her voice was barely there. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake nodded, more concerned about her condition than conversation. He could see the signs of cold exhaustion in her face, the kind that could turn dangerous if not cared for quickly. He placed another log on the fire, brightening the room, then set a kettle over the flames to warm water. The woman watched him with tired eyes, her breathing slow and shallow. She held the blanket tight around herself, drawing in the heat like it was the first gift she had been given in days. Jake didn't know who she was, where she had come from, or why she had been wandering through a winter storm alone. But he knew one thing, clearly. If she had arrived even an hour later, she might not have survived the night. And so, in the quiet warmth of a small cabin standing against a great winter storm, two strangers from different worlds sat in the soft glow of the fire, one offering shelter, the other clinging to the last threads of strength, and the night began to change the course of both their lives. The fire crackled softly as the warmth slowly filled the cabin, spreading out like gentle arms reaching for every corner. Jake watched the young woman carefully, making sure she was warming up. Her shivering had eased a little, though every now and then a small tremor passed through her shoulders. She sat close to the flames, holding the wool blanket tight, her eyes half open but alert enough to sense her surroundings. The storm outside had grown stronger, pushing snow against the windows and whistling through the edges of the cabin. But inside, the soft glow of the fire made the space feel protected, almost like a small world, separate from the harsh night. Jake filled a tin cup with warm water once the kettle steamed lightly. He knelt beside her and offered it slowly, not wanting to startle her. At first, she hesitated, as if unsure whether she should accept anything from a stranger. But the heat rising from the cup tempted her too strongly. She reached out with cold hands, her fingers trembling as she wrapped them around the metal cup. Her skin looked pale from the cold, her knuckles stiff. She lifted the cup to her lips and took a small sip. A tiny sigh escaped her, almost too soft to hear. The warm water seemed to bring some life back into her eyes. She kept the cup close, letting the steam brush her face as she held it with both hands. Jake settled onto a small wooden stool nearby, keeping his posture relaxed so she wouldn't feel pressured or afraid. He knew she needed time. Time to warm up, time to trust, time to understand where she was and who he was. He wasn't going to rush her. For a while, neither of them spoke. The quiet inside the cabin felt gentle, not uncomfortable. The only sounds were the wind outside, the popping of the fire, and the slow, steady breaths of the woman by the hearth. After a few minutes, Jake noticed the tension in her shoulders beginning to soften. Her breathing grew, a little deeper, less hurried. She unclenched her fingers from around the cup and rested it in her lap, though her hands still hovered nearby as if she wasn't ready to let go completely. "You're safe here," Jake said softly. His voice was calm, steady, and warm like a friendly hand reaching across a quiet space. "You don't need to worry." The woman didn't reply at first. She looked toward the fire, the flames reflecting gently in her dark eyes. She swallowed, gathering the courage to speak. When she finally lifted her gaze to Jake, he saw something delicate there, a mixture of fear and trust that felt fragile, like it could vanish with one wrong word. "My name is Nalin," she whispered. Jake nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile. She repeated his name quietly, as if testing the sound of it. "Jake." "Yes," he said, keeping his voice friendly but not overwhelming. Nalin pulled the blanket tighter around her, the corners of her lips lifting just a little. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest she had come yet. Her eyes drifted to the window, where snow piled high against the glass. She shivered again, more from memory than from the cold. "I was walking for a long time," she said softly. "The storm, it came very fast." Jake leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. He didn't interrupt. He let her speak at her own pace. "I was with my family," she continued. "We were traveling, moving to a different camp for the season. But the wind grew stronger. The snow was thick. I fell behind without knowing. Everything became white. I could not see the others anymore." Her voice faltered, and she looked down at her hands. The firelight danced across her fingers, showing the faint redness where the cold had bitten hard. Jake spoke gently. "That must have been frightening." She nodded slowly, still staring at the cup in her lap. "I tried to follow the path we were walking, but the wind covered it. I walked and walked, but the world looked the same in every direction." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Jake could see the exhaustion clinging to her like a shadow. The hours she had spent wandering through the storm must have drained her energy, her hope, everything she had inside her. "I thought I would not find shelter," she whispered. "Then I saw a small light, far away, very small. I followed it. It was the only thing I could see." Jake nodded slowly, understanding the picture she was painting. She must have seen the glow from his cabin window, the only light for miles in the cold darkness. "It was lucky you saw it," he said. "I'm glad you did." Nalin looked up at him again, her eyes soft but filled with deep relief. Jake felt something warm move through him at her words. He wasn't used to helping strangers, especially in the middle of a winter storm. But something about her knocking on his door, her trembling voice asking for shelter, had pulled at his heart in a way he didn't fully understand. He stood up quietly and walked to a wooden chest near the corner of the room. Inside were a few extra blankets and simple clothing he rarely used. He lifted out a large wool blanket. one thicker than the one she currently had around her shoulders. "You look like you could use another layer," he said gently. Nalin watched him approach but didn't pull away. When he draped the second blanket around her carefully, she lowered her head respectfully, accepting the warmth like a precious gift. Her fingers brushed the soft wool timidly, as if she hadn't felt something warm and comforting in days. "Thank you," she whispered again. Jake returned to his stool, keeping a respectful distance. He didn't want her to think he expected anything from her. Tonight was about giving her safety. Nothing more. The rest could wait. Outside, the storm had grown even stronger. Wind shook the walls softly, while snow piled higher along the door. But inside, the fire burned bright, casting long, dancing shadows along the wooden walls. After a while, Jake asked gently, "Are you hurt anywhere? Your hands? Your feet?" She shook her head slowly. "Only cold. Very cold." "We'll fix that," Jake assured her. "Just stay near the fire. When you feel ready, I can make something warm for you to eat." The mention of food brought a tiny spark to her eyes. Jake noticed it immediately. Hunger was a kind of exhaustion, too. One that often hid behind silence. "I would be thankful," she said softly. Jake stood and moved to the small cupboard on the wall. From inside, he pulled out a pot, some dried vegetables, and a bit of grain. He began preparing a simple stew, filling the cabin with comforting smells as the ingredients simmered. Nalin watched him the entire time. Not in fear, no. Her earlier hesitation had softened. Now she watched him with quiet curiosity, as if she were trying to understand the kind of person who lived alone in a cabin, yet opened his door without question to a stranger on the coldest night of the year. Jake stirred the pot and glanced over his shoulder. "You'll feel better after you eat. Warm food helps more than people think." Nalin nodded slowly. "My people say the same." When the stew was ready, Jake filled a bowl and handed it to her. She accepted it with both hands, inhaling the warm aroma before taking a careful sip. Her shoulders relaxed the moment the warmth reached her stomach. As she ate, Jake noticed her movements becoming steadier. Her breathing grew calmer, her eyes less clouded with exhaustion. Bit by bit, the storm's grip on her loosened. She looked up after a few minutes and spoke in a quiet, sincere voice. "You saved me tonight." Jake shook his head lightly. "I just opened the door. Anyone would have done the same." Nalin studied him for a long moment, her expression gentle but knowing. "No," she said softly. "Not everyone." Jake didn't know how to respond to that. Instead, he simply watched her eat, making sure she was comfortable. The storm continued outside. The fire continued inside. And for the first time since the night began, the cabin felt less lonely. Two people, once strangers, now shared a warm space in the middle of a frozen world brought together by fate, a thin blanket, and a quiet whisper at a door. The night grew quieter inside the cabin as the storm outside kept swirling through the dark plains. The fire glowed warmly, filling the room with soft orange light and gentle crackling sounds. Nalin rested near the hearth, wrapped in the thick blankets Jake had given her. Her cheeks had regained a bit of color, and her breathing had become steady and calm. The warmth had reached her skin and her spirit, easing the fear and cold she had carried for hours. Jake sat across from her, polishing a wooden bowl with an old piece of cloth. He didn't rush, didn't push her to speak, and didn't let the silence feel heavy. Instead, he worked quietly, giving her space to settle, to feel safe, to find comfort. Every now and then, his eyes drifted toward her, checking if she was still warm enough or needed anything more. Nalin watched him while pretending not to. She kept her gaze on the fire most of the time, but her eyes often moved toward Jake when he wasn't looking. She seemed curious about him, about the place she had found, about why he had helped her without hesitation. After finishing her bowl of stew, she placed it gently on the wooden floor beside her. The warmth of the food had filled her, and she felt energy slowly returning. Her hands no longer shook, and her mind felt clearer. Jake noticed and smiled softly. "Feeling a bit better?" "Yes," she said, her voice still quiet but steadier than before. "Much better. The warmth. It helped me." "I'm glad," Jake replied. "It's important to warm up slowly. Cold sneaks into the bones if you let it." She nodded thoughtfully. "In my family, we also say that the cold tries to enter the heart first." Jake paused his work, turning to her with a gentle, curious expression. "Is that something your elders tell you?" "Yes," she answered. "They say that when the cold reaches the heart, a person begins to lose hope. And when hope is gone, the body follows." She looked at her hands, folded neatly over the blanket. "When I was walking in the snow, I felt my hope growing smaller and smaller. I could hear my own breath, but everything else was quiet. It felt like the world had grown too big for me." Jake listened carefully, his expression thoughtful and sincere. "That must have been a very lonely feeling." "It was," she admitted. "I thought the storm would hide me forever." Her eyes lifted to meet his. "But then, I saw the light from your window." Jake nodded, remembering how the small glow of his cabin must have appeared to her a distant flicker in a world covered in white. "I'm glad you saw it." Nolan's eyes softened. "I am, too." A comfortable silence settled between them. The fire warmed the logs, making them glow brighter as the flames rose and fell. The storm outside still rattled the windows lightly, but its sound no longer felt frightening. With the safety of the cabin around them, the storm had turned into nothing more than background music, a reminder of the world outside, but no longer a threat. Jake stood and added another piece of wood to the fire. The flames welcomed it quickly, sending new light dancing across the walls. When he turned back toward Nalan, he saw her studying the small wooden carvings he kept on a shelf near the bed. They were simple figures, animals, mostly carved during quiet evenings. She pointed toward them with a small tilt of her chin. "You made those?" Jake looked a bit surprised at first, then smiled. "Yes, I carve when I have time." Nalan's eyes showed a gentle kind of interest. "They are very nice. The horse looks almost real." Jake chuckled softly. "I try my best. It's easier carving something you see every day." "Do you have horses outside?" she asked. "Yes," Jake replied. "Two of them. They're in the barn right now, warm and sheltered. I always make sure they're safe before a storm." Nalan nodded with quiet approval. "That is good. Animals feel the cold just as we do." Jake leaned against the table, relaxed. "My horses have been with me for years. I take care of them, and they take care of me." A small smile touched Nalan's lips. She admired the idea not just of the animals, but of the bond Jake had with them. "You live alone here?" she asked carefully, as if not wanting to pry too deeply. "For the most part, yes," Jake answered. "The nearest town is about a half-day's ride from here. I go there for supplies sometimes, but I spend most of my time working the land." "Do you like living like this?" Nalan asked. Jake took a moment to think. His eyes drifted around the cabin, the wooden beams, the shelves he built himself, the tools leaning neatly against the wall. "I do," he said finally. "It's quiet, peaceful. The land has its own way of speaking if you listen long enough." Nalan listened to his words with interest. "My people say that the land speaks to those who respect it." Jake nodded slowly. "I believe that." She looked into the fire for a while, thinking. The warmth played across her face, giving her features a gentle glow. Jake watched her quietly, noticing how calm she looked now compared to earlier. It made him feel relief he didn't quite understand. After a few minutes, Nalan spoke again. "My family. They will worry about me." "Nalan." Jake's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sure they will. They probably tried to find shelter, too, when the storm came." She nodded. My father always leads us safely. He would have guided everyone to a sheltered place. But when I got lost, they must not have known exactly where I was. I'm sure they'll look for you when the storm ends, Jake said gently. And you'll be warm and rested when that time comes. Nalin lowered her eyes. I hope so. You'll be all right, Jake reassured her. You're strong. You found your way through a storm. That tells me something. She lifted her gaze, curiosity in her expression. What does it tell you? That you have a brave heart, Jake said with a soft smile. Most people wouldn't have kept walking in weather like that. Nalin's cheeks warmed slightly, not from embarrassment, but from the unexpected kindness of his words. My mother used to say the same, she said quietly. She told me I carried courage in my steps. Jake nodded. Your mother sounds wise. She was, Nalin said, her voice soft and filled with fondness. She taught me many things before she passed. Jake lowered his head slightly, respectful of her memory. I'm sure she would be proud of you. Nalin wrapped the blanket a little tighter around her shoulders, feeling warmth not only from the fire but from Jake's gentle understanding. After a long, peaceful pause, she looked at him again. Why did you help me? She asked, her voice soft but sincere. You do not know me. And the storm, it was very strong. You could have stayed inside. You could have ignored the knocking. Jake took a slow breath. He didn't answer immediately, choosing his words carefully, thoughtfully. Because someone needed help, he said simply. And the right thing to do is always the right thing, even when it's hard. Nalin studied him for a long moment. Something in her expression softened, like a door gently opening in her heart. You are a good man, Jake, she whispered. Jake looked slightly embarrassed, rubbing the back of his neck. I just did what anyone with a warm cabin would do. No, Nalin said softly, shaking her head. Not everyone would open the door. Jake didn't argue. Instead, he walked to the small cupboard and took out another cup. He poured warm tea into it, then handed it to Nalin with care. She accepted it, the steam rising to warm her face. She held the cup close, taking in its comfort, letting it fill the quiet moment between them. Outside, the storm slowly began to ease, the wind softening, the snow falling more gently. Inside, the fire continued to glow warmly, lighting the cabin with steady comfort. Two people, once strangers on opposite sides of a cold night, now sat together in quiet companionship. Trust had begun to grow softly, gently, like the first hint of spring after a long winter. The storm outside had brought them together, but it was their shared humanity that kept them warm. Morning came slowly, as if the sun itself was tired from pushing through the thick layers of snow that covered the world outside. The sky had softened into a pale gray blue, and the storm had finally quieted. The cabin felt peaceful, warmed by the fire that still glowed in the hearth. Jake slept lightly in his chair near the window, wrapped in a blanket with one boot still on and the other half off, as if he had drifted to sleep while trying to take it off. Nalin woke first. She blinked a few times, letting her eyes adjust to the gentle morning light. The room felt warmer than it had the night before, and the blankets wrapped around her still held the heat from the fire. She sat up slowly, feeling rested for the first time since the storm began. Her gaze drifted to Jake. He looked peaceful in sleep, his hat tilted low over his eyes, his hands resting softly on his lap. A faint smile touched her lips. She didn't know how to explain the comfort she felt seeing him there, someone who had been a stranger only hours ago, yet had treated her with kindness from the moment she arrived at his door. She stood quietly, making sure not to wake him, and walked to the small window. When she pushed the curtain aside, her breath caught. The world outside was covered in untouched white. Snow lay thick on the ground, soft and bright under the pale morning sun. The trees wore heavy coats of frost, and the long fields stretched far and still, like a painting that had not yet dried. The land looked peaceful, but she knew appearances could be misleading. Snow that beautiful often hid deeper worries. She stared for a moment, her eyes following the gentle curves of the land. Then something caught her attention. Something faint, barely visible near the edge of the field. There were marks in the snow. They were small and scattered, like someone or something had moved quietly through the area early in the morning. The tracks curved around the cabin, not close enough to alarm her, but close enough to make her heart press a little tighter in her chest. She leaned closer to the window, watching the ground carefully. Her breath brushed the cold glass, forming a small cloud of fog that she quickly wiped away with her sleeve. The tracks were not from an animal. She knew that immediately. She had grown up reading the land, learning the language of prints and trails. These marks, she realized, belonged to people. Steps that moved lightly, crossing from the trees toward the cabin, then looping away again before disappearing into the white distance. She turned her head slightly, checking the soft rise and shape of the tracks. 2 sets of footsteps. No signs of dragging, no signs of haste. Just quiet and deliberate movement. Her heart filled with a mix of hope and caution. Jake stirred behind her, and she turned around as he sat up, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. His hair was slightly messy, and he let out a soft sigh before noticing Nalin by the window. "You're awake early," he said with a tired smile. "The light woke me," she replied softly. Jake nodded, stretching his arms. "It does. The storm's finally passed." She hesitated, then pointed gently toward the window. "I saw tracks outside." Jake sat up straighter. "Tracks?" "Yes," Nalin said. 2 sets. They came close, but not too close." Jake walked to the window beside her, pulling the curtain aside further. He squinted at the marks in the snow, studying them with a careful, thoughtful expression. "You have a good eye," he said after a moment. "I wouldn't have noticed those." Nalin breathed out slowly. "I learned to see things like that when I was young. My family taught me how to watch the land." "Do you think the tracks belong to your family?" Jake asked gently. She shook her head. "No. My family walks differently. Their steps are lighter, and they move in a certain pattern. These steps look cautious, like someone was watching the area." Jake studied the tracks again, thoughtful and quiet. He didn't show alarm, but his expression grew more focused. "Well," he said calmly, "whoever it was didn't come to the door. That means they weren't sure what or who they might find inside." Nalin nodded slowly, feeling a small chill along her spine. It wasn't fear exactly, just awareness. The world had many travelers, and not all traveled with friendly intentions. But Jake's calmness eased her worries. "It may be nothing," Jake said reassuringly. "Maybe just a couple of people passing through after the storm." "Maybe," she replied softly, though she wasn't completely convinced. Jake looked at her with a warm expression. "You're safe here, Nalin. That's what matters right now." She lowered her eyes, appreciating his words. "Thank you." He smiled and stepped toward the stove. "Let me make some breakfast. Something warm will help us think clearly." 7. Nalin watched him move around the kitchen with easy steps, collecting a few ingredients and lighting the small stove. She admired the gentle way he worked, everything done with care, nothing rushed. She continued to glance out the window, but the tracks stayed still and silent, with no new ones appearing. After a few minutes, the comforting smell of warm food filled the cabin. Jake served 2 bowls of simple grains cooked with a little honey. He handed one to Nalin and took a seat across from her at the table. She took a bite, letting the sweetness settle gently on her tongue. "This is very good," she said kindly. Jake grinned. "Well, I don't cook fancy meals, but I try my best." "I like simple meals," she replied. "They remind me of home." "One?" Jake watched her thoughtfully. Do you miss your family? Nalin paused. Her eyes drifted toward the fire. Yes, she whispered. Very much. They must be looking for me. Jake nodded slowly. I'm sure they are. And as soon as the snow softens a bit, we can try to find them. Nalin looked up, surprised. You would help me? Of course, Jake replied simply. You came here looking for safety. I'm not going to let you wander alone again. We'll find your family together. Warmth spread through Nalin's chest, not from the food, but from his kindness. She looked at him with gentle gratitude, unsure how to express everything she felt. Before she could speak, Jake stood and walked toward the door. I'm going to step outside for a moment, he said. Take a look around. I will come with you, Nalin offered quickly. Jake hesitated for a moment, then nodded. All right, but stay close. The snow is deep. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and followed him outside. The cold air greeted her sharply, but it wasn't as biting as the night before. It felt almost fresh, like a new beginning. Jake walked slowly, stopping near the tracks she had seen earlier. Nalin stood beside him, studying the shapes carefully. You were right, Jake said. 2 sets, and they stayed near the trees. They were watching, Nalin whispered, but they did not come closer. Maybe they were unsure, Jake said gently. Maybe they didn't want trouble. Nalin nodded, though a faint crease remained in her forehead. My people sometimes worry about those who follow quietly. Jake turned to her, his expression calm and steady. Well, you're not alone this time. Those words eased her heart more than she expected. She gave a small, grateful smile. They walked back to the cabin, brushing snow from their boots before stepping inside. The warmth welcomed them at once, wrapping around them like a soft, gentle embrace. As the morning continued, Jake prepared things they might need for travel water, extra blankets, and a few supplies. Nalin helped where she could, folding blankets neatly and organizing small bags. They worked side by side with comfortable silence between them. Every so often, Nalin caught herself glancing at Jake. She felt safe near him, not because he was strong or loud, but because his nature was steady. He made things feel calm, even when the world outside looked uncertain. When the sun rose higher in the sky, lighting the snow like tiny crystals, Nalin took a deep breath. I feel ready, she said softly. We can go when you are prepared. Jake nodded. We'll leave soon. The snow is deep, but the path ahead is clear enough. Nalin stepped toward the window one last time. The tracks were still there in the distance. But now, she didn't fear them, not with Jake beside her. The world outside was wide and white, and the journey ahead uncertain. But for the first time since the storm began, she felt hope rising inside her again. And hope, she knew, was stronger than any cold wind. Jake woke up before the sun rose the next morning. The air was still cold, but the storm had passed, leaving the wide land covered in soft white snow. The sky held a pale glow, promising a calm day ahead. Nalin was awake too, sitting near the fire with a quiet, thoughtful expression. She had slept well, and her strength had returned more than either of them expected. Still, Jake could see she was worried. She kept glancing toward the window, as if she sensed something outside. Jake stepped out for a moment to look around. The morning air was sharp on his face, and the snow crunched softly under his boots. He walked around the cabin and lowered his eyes to the ground. There were tracks, fresh ones, leading toward the trees. These tracks had not been there the day before. He felt his heart tighten, not out of fear, but out of caution and concern. Someone had passed close to his home, and it was not a deer or any wild animal. These were human steps, coming from the same direction Nalin had come from. He returned inside and closed the door gently behind him. Nalin looked up at him the moment she heard the sound, her eyes searching his face. She could read his expression before he even spoke. Jake sat down across from her and explained what he had seen. Nalin listened quietly, her hands folding together in her lap. She told him in a soft voice that a group had been near her people recently. People who did not wish her family well. She did not speak harshly about them, only stated the truth with calm honesty. She believed those tracks belonged to them. Jake felt a strong sense of responsibility settle in him. Nalin needed to return to her family before anyone else found her alone. She was safer near her own people, among those who knew her and could protect her properly. He knew the journey back would not be easy in the snow, but it needed to be done soon, while the sun was rising and the sky was clear. Nalin understood this too. She stood slowly, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders, and nodded to Jake. She thanked him quietly, not only for shelter, but for the kindness he had shown without hesitation. She did not have many words in English, yet her expression said much more than spoken language could. Jake felt grateful in return. Her presence, even for this short time, had changed the quiet rhythm of his life. Jake prepared the horse and packed a small bundle of supplies for the trip. Nalin helped as best she could, though he could see she was still tired. When everything was ready, Jake offered her his hand to help her mount the horse. She accepted with a gentle smile. The morning sun had begun to rise, painting the sky in soft colors that stretched across the snowy land. As they began their journey, the air felt peaceful. The horse moved slowly through the snow, leaving long tracks behind them. Jake walked beside the horse, guiding it with steady steps. Nalin sat atop the animal, keeping her eyes on the open land ahead. She seemed more relaxed now that she was heading toward her family, though she still held a quiet seriousness, as if she understood the importance of every moment. The land around them was beautiful in its stillness. The storm had left the hills smooth and bright, with sunlight glimmering across the surface like tiny crystals. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with snow. Nalin watched everything carefully, taking in each detail, as if the land itself was speaking to her. Jake noticed this and admired her connection with nature. He had lived on the land all his life, but the way Nalin saw it made him see it differently too. More alive, more meaningful. They traveled for several hours, stopping only once to rest the horse and warm their hands. During this short break, Nalin and Jake shared a simple meal Jake had packed. They sat on a fallen log, the sun warming their faces while the wind remained gentle. They spoke a little, mostly simple words and gestures, yet every exchange felt warm and respectful. Even without a shared language, they understood each other with ease. When they continued, the snow became thinner as they moved closer to the area where Nalin's family often set camp during the winter. She began recognizing landmarks, small hills, certain trees, even the curve of the land. Her face brightened slightly each time she recognized something familiar. Jake could see the comfort returning to her spirit. Later in the afternoon, they reached a wide clearing bordered by tall, straight pines. Nalin lifted her hand, signaling for Jake to stop. Her eyes were fixed ahead, filled with emotion. In the distance, faint but clear, smoke rose into the sky from several small fires. It was her camp. Her family was there. Jake felt a sense of relief wash through him. They had made it without trouble. Nalin placed her hand over her heart and exhaled softly, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. As they stepped into the clearing, figures began to appear between the trees. Several people from the camp had noticed them approaching. Their steps quickened, and soon Nalin's family surrounded her with soft voices and grateful expressions. They were gentle with her, touching her shoulders and holding her hands, checking that she was unharmed. Nalin spoke to them in her language, her voice calm but full of emotion. Jake stayed a little distance back, not wanting to intrude. He watched quietly as Nalin reunited with her loved ones. After a few moments, two older members of the group approached Jake. Their expressions held gratitude and respect. They understood what he had done for Nalin. They thanked him in their own language, and although Jake could not understand the words, he understood the warmth behind them. Nalin stepped forward then, walking slowly toward Jake. Her eyes were gentle and full of meaning. She held out a small woven bracelet, handmade and simple, yet crafted with clear care. She placed it in Jake's hand and closed his fingers around it. It was a gift, one that spoke of respect, friendship, and gratitude. Jake felt touched, more than he expected. He told her she was safe now, and that he was glad he could help. Nalin nodded, her eyes shining a little, though she kept her calm expression. There was a quiet moment where neither spoke, yet it felt full of understanding. Two people from different worlds, brought together by a night of cold and a simple act of kindness. Jake turned back toward his horse, preparing for the journey home. As he mounted, he looked over his shoulder one last time. Nalin stood with her family, wrapped in warm blankets, sheltered and safe. She raised her hand in a small wave, a gesture filled with gratitude. Jake returned the gesture, then guided his horse back toward the snowy hills. The ride home felt different than the ride out. The land looked calmer, the sky brighter. Jake felt a quiet peace settling in his heart. The world had not changed, but something inside him had. That long night, the gentle whisper at his door, and the journey that followed had given him a memory he would never forget. When he reached his cabin again, the sun was setting, casting warm orange light across the snow. The cabin felt the same, yet somehow felt warmer, as if the memory of kindness lingered inside its walls. Jake hung the small woven bracelet near the window, where the light could touch it. It reminded him of the courage of the young woman who had knocked on his door and the quiet strength she carried even in great hardship. Jake sat by the fire that evening, the crackling warmth filling the room. He felt content, knowing he had helped someone in need and that she had reached her family safely. Outside, the snow lay untouched and peaceful, and the night sky glittered with stars. Jake closed his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle around him. In that moment, he realized something simple but powerful. Kindness, even in the coldest moments, can bring light to the darkest nights. And sometimes, a single knock on the door can change a person's life in ways they never expect.